Well, in this hour today, I'm going one-on-one with an award-winning journalist, Natasha Alford. Natasha is out with a brand new book called American Negra. And the book is a memoir of sorts, but it's also, according to some reviews, it's part cultural analysis. And it tells the story of Natasha growing up in a working class family from the city of Syracuse, New York. Critics call it a smart book full of vivid prose. They say the book illustrates the complexity of being multi ethnic in upstate New York. Also, lots of revelations in the book about identity, about colorism, and about how this country treats Afro Latinos. We'll get into some of the powerful passages in the book, particularly those around skin color and around hair. Also, Natasha is a graduate of Harvard University after she attended Harvard after attending public schools. So I'll talk to her about what that journey was like to go from a public school system to one of the nation's most elite universities, one of the universities that's been in the news lately because of its protest on campus. And I think I saw Natasha actually on Harvard or one of the other campuses talking to students about the protest. So in addition to talking with her about her book, she is a CNN political analyst. So of course, we got to talk to her about some of the politics of today, including Biden's new stance on sending military aid to Israel, as well as what was happening in that courtroom in Manhattan today. So we got a lot to talk about with Natasha Alford. Glad to have her joining us in this hour. Welcome to the show, Natasha. So glad to be in conversation with you this evening. I want to just read what has been written about your new book. It says it's a coming of age story about what it's like to live at the intersections of race, culture, gender, and class, all while staying true to yourself. American Negra is a captivating look at one woman's experience being Negra in the United States as the movement to highlight Afro-Latin identity and overlook histories of the African diaspora grows. American Negra illustrates the diversity of the Black experience in the larger fabric of American society. Wow, that is a mouthful. And I just want to say congratulations to you for writing this book, for writing what is also described as a memoir, because clearly, when you think about authors who write memoirs, they're a lot older than you typically. So that's kind of my first question for you. What motivated you to think about writing this book in this moment?
Well, first, Areva, I just have to say thank you for having me. I've watched you on TV for years. You're always insightful. You're always sharp. And so really, you pave the way for women like me to come into TV commentary by just representing so well. So I'm grateful to be on the show. American Negra felt so urgent for a lot of reasons. I mean, first and foremost, Toni Morrison always said that, if that book that you think should exist in the world isn't there, you have to write it. And growing up, I never saw a protagonist, whether in, fiction or even just nonfiction, who talked about the intersection of two groups that are really central to the American experience. We talk about Blacks and Latinos as if they're these two totally separate categories, but there are a lot of people, 6 million people, according to the Pew Research Center, who are Afro-Latino, 6 million adults in the US. So I thought that this experience should be conveyed to the world. It's my experience. It's not everyone's experience, but that it should exist. But also there's a second sort of theme to this story, and it's about the pursuit of the American dream. And, you talked about your own children being in school and graduating, right? We're all pursuing what we've been told is the path to education, to social mobility. But what are the struggles that come along with that? And I found that I was sort of an inner city poster child for, she went from public school to Harvard. And that was like the end of the story. That was the happy ending, but it was way more complicated than that. So I wanted to be honest about some of the ups and downs in hopes that maybe it inspired others.
And thank you again for being transparent and sharing your story. That can be really it can be overwhelming. It can be distressing when
Mhm.
you have to be vulnerable and talk about experiences. I know you tell a lot of personal stories in the book. Particularly, I was, I gravitated to the story that you told about the hair, because we know in our community, Black community in particular, your hair is, such an important thing. We all grow up with hair stories. Why did you, choose that story, like to talk about hair? Because there's so many stories I'm sure you could have chosen to put in the book.
Yeah, well, I wanted to show how so much of what we see as the objective truth is really it's created, right? So when I'm in one culture on my African American side of the family, I have so-called good hair. Everybody's like, "Oh, your hair's so long, it's so beautiful. We love the texture." But then when I go to the sort of Puerto Rican side, that world, that sphere of Latin America, my hair is not good hair. It's frizzy, it's big, it's considered pelo malo. And so I thought it was important to show just how culture is created and values are reinforced and anti-Blackness persists. And in both cultures, there's a bit of policing around hair. We see it even with, the greats like Gabby Douglas and Simone Biles. They're in the Olympics and they're doing these incredible feats, and yet social media is like obsessed with their hair and whether it's perfect or not, right? So where does that come from? What's the legacy of colonialism today that exists in terms of what we think of as beautiful? I thought those conversations were really important. And so that's why there's a whole chapter dedicated to hair in the book.
Yeah, definitely a lot of policing of our hair. I want to ask you this. I'm thinking about a young lady that I know. Her name is Sade, and she's running for office here in Los Angeles for a state rep office. And she's Afro Latina. And her opponent, she's running against a Latino man in this race to become our next state assembly member. And she said that he is trying to paint her as Black, and himself as the true Latino in the race, to curry favor with a large base of Latino voters. And she said that it's forcing her, to have to move about the space differently and to campaign in a way that makes it clear to the Latino voters in this district that she is, a Latino as well, a Latina. So, how do you, navigate that? And one of the things Sade told me is that her sister, she said, her sister leans more Latina. And she says she has most of her friends, most of her social life. Whereas Sade says her whole existence, and she's probably about your age, has been, in the African American community. So, did you face that, like having to choose who your friends were, what group you were going to be a part of? And do you also face people like this opponent of Sade, trying to deny, a part of her cultural identity?
What a fascinating connection. For a lot of Afro Latinas, the decision's made for you. It's literally about the shade of your skin. So people will treat you as they see you, right? And when you're growing up in this continental US context, which I think is really important, this idea of Black and white, it's very clear. And so I talked to a lot of fellow Latinas and Puerto Ricans specifically who move upstate New York, which is, again, a big part of the story, the North with its own version of racism and segregation. And members of the same family will be treated completely different based on the shade of their skin.
Mm.
Right. And so members of the family are treated as Black people with the stigma that comes with that. Members who are seen as white are treated as white people with the privilege that comes with that. And so it just goes to show that as much as, Latinos, we often talk about how mixed our families are, and we don't have problems with racism because we have, people of all different colors. We're still subject to a racist society. And oftentimes that sort of colorblind philosophy leads some Latinos to ignore or sort of deny the existence of racism. But as you see right in this race that you're talking about, it's being weaponized. And I think a lot of Afro Latinas and Afro Latinos are forced to perform their identity to prove their authenticity, speak Spanish,
Yeah.
tell us what you know how to cook. Who did you grow up with, right? Like there's all of these tests that people give you. And I write in the book, in American Negra, about the tests that I started to get as I was older from people who wanted to see how authentically Latina I was. And as a coping mechanism, I actually just stopped caring.
Hmm.
Outside, I stopped caring, right? I just, sort of found my community in the African American community, in the Black community, and didn't really sometimes even address the fact that I had Latin roots because I didn't want to be questioned. So
Hmm.
everybody faces and different things and chooses to handle things a different way.
So, did you choose that, Natasha? Because in upstate New York, Syracuse, where you were growing up, you were in a Black community versus, your family living in a Latin community. Is that why you kind of naturally gravitated to, a group of Black friends or the Black community?
I think that it's a reflection of where I lived, but also there were different points where I was surrounded by different cultures, right? So in the young years, all my babysitters were Puerto Rican. We were in a very heavy Puerto Rican community. But as I got older, it really was the African American community that embraced me. I went to
Mhm.
African American Baptist church, right? I went to a Saturday academy with a Black sorority. These are the organizations that took me under their wing and they welcomed me and didn't question whether I belonged. So some of it was about outreach, and then it eventually became about what felt like home. But here's the thing: you cannot deny any part of you, right? You can say that you are one thing, or maybe you don't talk about some part of you, but it's always there. And
Right.
so this book is really reclaiming those roots, and it's a deep investigation of the ways in which my Puerto Rican culture still has shaped me and influences me, and sort of the things that my mother taught me. And the last thing I'll say about this is that this is also about the intersectionality of race, gender, and ethnicity,
Hmm.
because my mother is a racially ambiguous Puerto Rican woman. There are Black Puerto Ricans. There are Puerto Ricans who are white with blonde hair and blue eyes. She was racially ambiguous. And so there was just certain aspects of Black womanhood that she couldn't really talk to me about. She couldn't
Mm.
relate to because I'm Black, right? Like at the end of the day. And so I had to find mentors. I had to find women in my own family on my father's side who there were certain things I could just relate to them about.
Right.
So gender is as much a part of this conversation as race and ethnicity.
When you write a book like this, and I've written several books, and one that was the most personal for me when I was writing my book, The Everyday Advocate, because I was writing about my son's diagnosis with autism. You have to be really vulnerable. So, what can you tell us about what experiences you had? Like, what did you learn? I should say about yourself in writing a book about your family, where you had to share stories about what you just said about your mother being racially ambiguous, about having to go to your father's relatives to really identify with Black women. So did you learn anything that was kind of shocking to you about your own self?
Yeah, well, it's hard to write a memoir when you are younger because a lot of people you're writing about are still alive. You're still seeing them. You still, in some cases, want relationships with them. I learned a lot. My family, there were some things that we never talked about, things I was afraid to ask my parents, but the book gave me an excuse to ask the questions. And there were actually some things that we healed around. There was certain pains that I never addressed in my life, but through the respect for my family, particularly with my parents, I wanted them to know everything I was writing, and I gave them the manuscript before it came out to get their blessing, and thankfully I got it. But I think some of the other, difficult parts to write were related to health and talking about
Mm.
having chronic illness as a young person, because in America, there's sort of the culture is you don't talk about health issues, you actually hide them because
Mhm.
you don't want to be discriminated against in terms of professional opportunities, or have people see you differently, or have people see you as sick and unable to do certain things. I had to get over that sort of pride and the ego and the sort of protective shield that had often put up, because you have to be honest for it to be truly valuable, for people to read and connect, and for it to be helpful to others. So that was it was hard, but it was totally worth it.
So I know, Natasha, you said there's 6 million people who identify as Afro or Afro Latina or Afro Latino. Is this book written for that population, that demographic of 6 million people? And if not, who else, do you think will benefit the most from reading this book?
I'm going to say that this book is for everybody. I think if you love reading, you know, the universality, the power of that in stories, that you can read about somebody from across the world and feel connected to them. So I really wanted everyone to put their hands on this book. My dream is for it to actually be in schools and for it to be part of curriculum around identity and citizenship and belonging and education. That's the dream. But there is this community who has often been ignored and erased and overlooked. And I hope that they finally feel seen through reading this book. And I have spoken to people out on the book tour who've been like, finally, somebody's talking about my experience, or even people who will say, my daughter is an American Negra, right? And I can finally give her this book to make her know that she's not alone. So that's the joy of writing, both with a specific audience in mind, but also really thinking about what are the lessons that everyone can take from the story.
So you talked about the response on the book, trail, or your book tour, I should say. And I follow you on Instagram, so I see some of the places that you have been, some of the folks that have interviewed you, and some of the crowds that have come out to listen to you talk about the book and your experiences. Tell me one of the most interesting book tour events that you've had. Like, again, some interesting person, some interesting insight as a result of someone coming out to hear you talk and read excerpts from the book.
Yeah, I'm really always surprised by the scenes that touch people. There's one scene where I write about the first time being pulled over by police. And in this upstate New York context where we go into the suburbs, we are a city family. And the first time we dare go into the suburbs, one of the first times, we get pulled over. And my father, who is Black, is profiled, even though he's not driving. And just the effect that had on me as a 5-year-old girl. There were people who said that scene brought them to tears. And I actually thought of taking it out of the book because I thought, it might not be dramatic enough, right? It might not leave an impression because people are so used to these dramatic sort of, gory, graphic interactions with police. But in the subtlety, I think people felt what I felt in that moment. So that was something that was really memorable for me. I've had people of all ages, again, races, just connect with the book. There was an older white man when I was in Boston who approached me and pointed out a scene about when I get invited to the Saturday Academy for Black, that's sponsored by a Black women's civic organization in Syracuse. And he's just, something about that letter, the invitation and the power of that really struck him. Who would have thought? So this is the power of writing, is why we have to tell our stories. You can't predict how it will hit people. You just have to tell your truth.
It takes a lot of guts to write your first book, first of all, and then to write a book that is so personal, that is in part a memoir about your own experiences growing up as a multi-ethnic girl, then woman, living in upstate New York. So thank you for sharing your story, for being vulnerable, and for shining a light, like you said, on 6 million people who share an identity with you, and just being able to say to those people that you matter, that we see you, is such an important thing. I want to talk to you a little about politics, though, and what's happening on these college campuses. I think I saw on your Instagram page that you were interviewing students. Now, were you on which college campus were you on doing some interviews of the students who were out protesting?
Yes, thank you, Areva, and thank you so much for the kind words. So actually, in addition to being an author, I'm also a graduate student. I'm currently at Princeton University earning a Master of Public Policy at the School for International and Public Affairs. And these are my classmates, right? So, as a journalist and a student, I felt it was important to go out and document some of what I was seeing. And so I spoke with students at the Gaza Solidarity encampment on Princeton's campus the first day that the encampment went up. And, there were just so many emotions. I particularly, spoke with Jewish students because I wanted to understand how they were feeling in this moment and what was motivating them to come out. And some of the Jewish students that I spoke with, really were just outraged by the humanitarian situation that's unfolding in Gaza. We know that aid workers have been killed, journalists have been killed, on top of innocent civilians. And the school's motto is in the nation's service and in the service of humanity. And so they feel that it is their responsibility to use their privilege in this moment to speak up about what is happening. So that was the general sentiment on that first day.
So were these Jewish students, Natasha, a part of the pro-Palestinian protest that was happening on Princeton's campus, or were they just there observing, or were they counter protesters? Because we've seen on campuses like UCLA, where you've had the pro-Palestinian protesters, then you've had this large group of what they are calling counter protesters, folks who were kind of anti the pro-Palestinian protesters. So I'm just trying to understand the Jewish students that you talk to, where do they fall?
Yes, the Jewish students that I spoke with were actually there, protesting to end the bombing and the killing of civilians in Gaza. So these students really are pro-peace, but you could say that they were pro-Palestinian students. And I think it just spoke to the diversity of the crowd that was there. You had folks from all sort of parts of the university. There were graduate students, there were undergraduate students, and even some faculty who stepped out in support. I think that was really, one of the things that struck me the most. And there was a classmate of mine who was arrested initially because of putting up a tent, which was not allowed. It was, it prohibited. The campus sent out an email the night before actually the encampment went up and said that certain forms of protests would be prohibited. And because these two students didn't heed warnings, two students were arrested initially, and then 11 more students were arrested later. So, this is very real. But I have to say that the university, the campus climate has been one of dialogue throughout the year. There have been workshops, there have been teach-ins. I think the school did a pretty solid job of modeling what it's like to bring people from different perspectives into the room. And so for me as a journalist, it's been a year of learning. I cover domestic issues. I actually hadn't really known as much about Palestine and Israel and this conflict until I went into a university environment. And I think that's a testament to students are there to learn. This is the time when you learn about yourself, but also about the world. And so I'm not surprised that students are engaging. And in some ways, in a deeper way than some of the folks who are kind of just talking about this on a surface level or just looking at quick headlines. So that is why I'm not surprised that these protests are happening.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that the students that you interviewed, the Jewish students that you interviewed, were actually there in support of peace, and of course, there with the pro-Palestinian protesters, because the way that the protests have been reported, for the most part, suggests that there's this great divide, right? That there's the Jewish students who are on one side, and they are in opposition to the Arab American, the Muslim students, the African Americans who are, painted as the pro-Palestinian protesters. And the reality is, looking at the protests and listening to people who've, spoken out, whether on TV, radio, and print, is there are many Jewish, Americans, Jewish people who are fully in support of a ceasefire, fully in support of a two-state solution, fully in support of the protests that are happening on campuses. But, oftentimes that gets lost in the media reports because, they want to set up this divide and, make there be this kind of very strict division. Like if you're Jewish, you have to be pro-Palestinian. And it's far from what we know the truth to be about some of these protests. And I'm glad to hear you say that Princeton is one of the campuses where there's been this open dialogue, because we've seen some other campuses around the country have not figured out a way to do that. And I'm sure you watched some of the hearings, or all of the hearings, maybe yesterday, of those secondary school leaders who went to Capitol Hill who were so incredibly poised and, responded in a way that you would have expected some of the university presidents who went before that same education committee, the GOP education committee. What do you make of kind of how that committee has treated those folks that have been forced to appear before it, particularly folks like our late, not late in the sense of dead, but our former president of Harvard University, Dr. Gay?
Yeah, well, I was pretty outspoken about the fact that, President Gay found herself in the crosshairs of quite a few folks who came to that testimony looking for blood, looking for a scapegoat in that moment. It was beyond concerns about anti-Semitism, which are, anti-Semitism is completely unacceptable. And yet you could tell in the questioning that there was more at play here. And once we saw the attacks on President Gay related to academic scholarship and, critics of DEI sort of coming out of the woodworks and jumping on this moment, you could see that there was much more at play here than actually caring about the safety of students. And so, look, we all have eyes. We can see what's happening. And I think it's when you tell people that what they're seeing is not real, that people really start to lose faith and question people who are in authority. And I think it's very important that the media be balanced in its coverage, that it be honest in its coverage, because you will lose people if, the reality of what they're seeing playing out is not being represented, or it seems like it's being suppressed. So in the case of the campus protest, I talked to a protester who said that the reality of protests is that there are certain people who attach themselves to movements who are more extreme. And, we saw that with Black Lives Matter, that there were certain people who were used as sort of the excuse to dismiss the entire movement when the majority of the movement was quite peaceful. And so in these moments, it's unacceptable for certain people who use these moments to abuse, right, to denigrate. But the majority of students that I saw on my campus, that is not the energy that they were bringing. And so, protest is about disrupting that which is comfortable. Right. And I think a lot of the students are being brave because they have a lot to lose. And we've seen people literally create consequences just for simply expressing views. And that's really scary. And yet the young people are still, fighting and showing up and speaking their truth in the name of saving people's lives.
Yeah, no, definitely consequences ranging from suspensions to expulsions to folks who've actually lost jobs. Mm-hmm. There's a group of judges who were appointed by Donald Trump who came out, federal court judges who came out and said they're not going to hire any students that attend Columbia University or Columbia's law school because, in their words, Columbia had become this, ground zero for promoting basically what they consider to be wokeness. So there are a lot of consequences, and students have faced some dire consequences, including arrest. Shouldn't forget about that. But the irony is there's a story today in the papers, one of the big papers, New York Times, about the GOP leaders that have been the biggest promoters of anti-Semitism. And the article brilliantly goes through and identifies comments and statements made by GOP leaders. And to see them really use campus presidents and university presidents as a way to try to, say they're standing up and standing against anti-Semitism, but we haven't seen them bring those same leaders who are on record making anti-Semitic remarks before this committee. Just speaks to the hypocrisy that we're seeing in Washington on so many different levels. We got to talk about that courtroom performance today, a courtroom testimony, depending on how you see it. Stormy Daniels was back in the hot seat today, drilled by Trump's lawyers for over 3 hours. And this election is going to be influenced by what's happening in a Manhattan courtroom where Donald Trump is standing trial for allegations of falsifying business records related to his efforts to suppress the story that Stormy Daniels, an adult film star, was going to tell about an affair, a sexual encounter she had with him in 2006. So, Natasha, today, Stormy Daniels wrapped up her testimony after 3 really grueling hours of cross examination from Donald Trump's lawyer, one of his lawyers. And folks are already talking about, whether the approach by Trump's lawyer helped him in terms of his case moving closer to an acquittal, or was this just a performance by the attorney for an audience of one, i.e., Donald Trump, because Trump can't say anything about Stormy Daniels because of this gag order. What did you make of the cross examination today?
I think the thing that stood out for me was this tactic of shaming, right? It's kind of an old trick in the book. We've seen it before in terms of emphasizing that she was a porn star, trying to get her to, address this idea of faking and sort of acting as being part of what she does as a porn star. Almost to undermine her testimony or to try to discredit her. And I just think that the times have changed. We are in an era where there is perhaps more conversation about the way that some of these encounters play out. That just because somebody might do sex work or because they're a porn star, or they're a stripper, that doesn't mean that they could have been violated. It doesn't mean that somehow the stories that they're telling have no merit. So, I agree with kind of how you frame this, which is that some of the motivation might be this lawyer trying to do what Donald Trump can't do because he's gotten in trouble many times. He's been fined already.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is about also his discomfort of having to sit in that courtroom and hear some of the things that she said. This is, one way to sort of hit back.
So, politically, there's a lot of debate about what this trial may do or may not do in terms of helping or hurting Donald Trump's chances of winning the presidency in November. There are some folks who say it doesn't matter. If he gets convicted, if he's acquitted, it just won't matter. It won't change their votes. But there are others who, have said if he is convicted in this case, that would have a substantial impact on how they're going to vote, or big groups of people are going to vote. What's your sense about what impact, if any, this trial, having a former president be in a criminal trial in a state court where the most salacious, intimate, personal details of a sexual encounter that he had with someone other than his wife, while we have to remember this is during the time he had just married his new wife. He had just had their baby, Baron. So for a lot of people, you would think, particularly Christian right, this would be highly problematic for them. But is it, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, that contradiction has always gotten me. I think it's unprecedented territory that we're in. As you said, we've not seen this before with a president on trial in this way. And so I just think that there's certain things that we won't know until it happens. And for some people, this could be just something that they can't accept, right? If he is convicted, it's a line that's just going to be too much for them to cross. But for his most ardent supporters, it's just another proof point that this is supposedly a political witch hunt. There's no conviction that's going to change their mind about their support for him. But I think it's those folks who are in the middle, who are on the fence. And one other point here is that this 24 hours news cycle can exhaust everyday people, right? They can't keep up with the criminal accounts. They're like, which trial are we talking about? And so in some sense, when you get overwhelmed, you can tune out and you can also forget. And I think that there's this Trump era has made so many things that used to be offensive normalized. It's kind of taken the shock value away. And so hearing some of this testimony could remind people of some things that they actually weren't okay with, that really are uncomfortable. And when you juxtapose that with Joe Biden, who's out there trying to talk about infrastructure, he's talking about AI, he's talking about Microsoft. And yes, he's also in the center of an awful international conflict, which is breaking his coalition apart in terms of Democratic and progressive voters. But at least we're talking about policy when we're talking about him. Um, and there are folks who will try to make, conversations about Biden, about his age, his health, etc. But a conversation about age versus a conversation about an affair, I mean, those are two different things. So I just think it reminds us of the state of the presidency, that we are having these conversations with this particular candidate.
So, this is the chaos, right? This is the chaos that we saw in the Trump lead up to his presidency and during his presidency, particularly those, last days of his presidency. And you would think, Natasha, that this chaos would cause people to say, oh my God, never again. And that some of the polls that have come out would be dramatically different, that you'd have, a 10-point or 15, even maybe a 20-point spread between Trump and Biden. But most of the polls that continue to, come out, and it's early, of course, we know that, and polls aren't always accurate, but those polls have them neck and neck, and some actually have Donald Trump up. How do we explain that?
Well, Donald Trump never let go of his party. It remained the party of Donald Trump until the end, even the nasty, dirty end, which was January 6th. We saw leaders who were appalled that day completely fold and change their positions once they realized how many constituents were still behind Donald Trump. So there hasn't been courageous leadership from Republicans to take back their party. So of course you have everyone, in terms of the GOP side of things, falling in line. And these are the options that we've given the American people. And I think there's also an understanding gap, that there was a failure of communication on the part of the Biden-Harris administration and Democrats to articulate, this is what we're doing for you all, right? These are the long-term investments that we're making, that maybe you don't see it right away, but this is how it's going to, transform the American economy. This is how it's going to give you opportunities in terms of labor and employment. I think there's been a failure of communication, so that even the work they're doing, they're not getting credit for it. Right. So you can't just keep your head down and work. You have to let people know what you're doing in a way that's accessible to them. So with the disillusionment, the lack of understanding, and then the limited options they've been given, which is a rematch, you're seeing people say, all right, let's go back to the other guy,
Yeah.
and some of it is just flat out, the sort of MAGA, some people will call it a cult, that
Right.
no matter what Donald Trump does, they're going to be behind him. But this is why we're in this place right now, where it's neck and neck.
Well, we are out of time. Thank you so much, Natasha. Again, make sure you pick up her book. It's called American Negra. She is an award-winning journalist, Natasha Alford. Thank you for being with me.